Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside. And for the environmental series today, I'd like to welcome back Dr. Thomas Bridgman to Lakeside. Thomas is a professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Toledo and the director of the U Toledo Lake Erie Center. His research centers on environmental challenges facing Lake Erie, especially HABs and dead zones. He earned degrees from Miami University, Ohio State University, and the University of Michigan. And today's session is titled Taking the Pulse of Lake Erie. In the decade following the Toledo water crisis, harmful algal blooms, or HABs, in Lake Erie have become a topic of intense research with Ohio and Michigan universities, and agencies becoming national leaders in HAB studies. HAB research aims to understand how blooms form and become toxic, predict and prevent HABs in a challenging climate, and protect drinking water, supplies, and human health. And this lecture will present recent Lake Erie research highlights and a bold new idea for reducing HABs in Lake Erie. I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Thomas Bridgman.
Thank you, John. Does everybody hear me? You can hear me well? Okay. I see people in the back. Thanks. Well, thanks for coming today. I was here 3 years ago and gave a talk something like this, but it's been updated, and hopefully you'll come away with some insight on what's going on with Lake Erie today. So sit back, enjoy the talk, enjoy the air conditioning, and we can get started. So this is my title slide, but let's just take a second to look at the title slide. This is the harmful algal bloom. I'll just call them HAB. HAB, we say HAB. This is the HAB, or harmful algal bloom, from 2017 in western Lake Erie. And you can see it's covering most of the western part of the lake. But one thing I want to point out is this, and I've got my green laser pointer because it's algae, so I get green. I want you to notice this big plume of blue, clear water coming down from the Detroit River. That's coming down from the upper Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Huron, Superior. So I'll be talking about that plume of water later, but this picture illustrates it pretty well. So before I get into the talk, I want to just introduce you to the Lake Erie Center, where I am the director. The Lake Erie Center is in Oregon, Ohio, right on the shore of the lake next to Maumee Bay State Park. And we're located right there. And of course, this is right next to the Maumee River. And the Maumee River drains a large watershed. It's the source of most of the harmful algal bloom problems that we have. And so here at the Lake Erie Center, we have a front row seat to harmful algal blooms every year. We don't just do harmful algal bloom research at the Lake Erie Center. We do a variety of things. One of the main programs that we have is fishery research. We have a very large program that is dedicated towards eradicating an invasive fish species called the grass carp. You've probably heard of Asian carp, these fish that got into the Illinois River, Mississippi River. They jump out of the water. You might have seen videos of people fending off these jumping fish. There's 4 species of invasive carp, and one of them is the grass carp. Grass carp are already in Lake Erie, but they are in low numbers. And so the idea is they are in such low numbers, we might be able to eradicate them before they get a big foothold in Lake Erie. So there's a big concentrated effort involving state of Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, the U.S. Geological Survey, the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, all sort of concentrating their effort in northwest Ohio and trying to eradicate these grass carp. And we have these boats that go out in the lake, or go out on the rivers, Sandusky River, Maumee River, and others, and they're electroshock boats. They shock the fish community in the water, and when the fish float up to the surface, you grab the grass carp and pull them out of the water. The other fish that get shocked just recover and swim away. So that's a big program that we have, eradicating grass carp. Also, we're trying to help the fish that we do want to recover in Lake Erie, such as sturgeon. I don't know if you know about sturgeon, but sturgeon are an ancient bony fish that used to be really prevalent throughout the Great Lakes, but they were mostly eradicated about 100 years ago. And now we're trying to bring sturgeon back into Lake Erie. There's a breeding program at the Toledo Zoo where they raise sturgeon from tiny little hatchlings up to maybe 3-inch long fish, and then they release thousands of these little baby sturgeons into the Maumee River each year, and hopefully they go out into Lake Erie and grow, and eventually in about 10 or 15, 20 years, they'll start to reproduce themselves and come back into the Maumee River. So we are reintroducing sturgeon. Here's a kid who gets to name, you get to name your baby sturgeon and let it go back out into the river. So we're helping the fish that we want and trying to eradicate fish that we don't want. We also do a lot of environmental research. We are heavily involved in H2 Ohio. I'll be talking about that a little bit more later. And this is the governor's effort to help restore Lake Erie through a variety of measures. And when we are involved, especially in wetland research, there's a big effort to restore wetlands in Northwest Ohio, and we are involved with studying how well that effort is going. Right now, there's 170 total. I think this slide is now out of date, probably up to 200 wetland projects being restored in Northwest Ohio. And then the bulk of my talk is on what I do, which is harmful algal bloom research. So I won't go into detail here because I'll be talking more about that later. We do a fair amount of education and outreach. We've had a program where we take high school students and teachers out on the Sandpiper, which is a boat that goes up and down the Maumee River, take classes out and teach them about water science, watershed science. We are starting to reintroduce our evening lecture series, hopefully this fall, and do other outreach things. So to get into the talk proper now, I just want to give you a brief outline of what I'll be talking about. A little bit about Western Lake Erie harmful algal blooms, the past that led to where we are now, and then what's the bloom going to look like this year. You might have known NOAA just came out with a harmful algal bloom forecast for 2024. I'll talk about that. And then the bulk of the time will be spent on efforts to prevent and mitigate harmful algal blooms. So I'll be talking about all the different ways that we are dealing with the blooms that we have now, a little bit more about H2 Ohio programs, and then the Ohio Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative. And then finally, I'll be talking about an idea that kind of hatched inside my brain about a new approach to fixing Lake Erie. So that'll be the last part. So as you might remember, Toledo had a harmful algal bloom water crisis in 2014, and this is the 10-year anniversary of it. So there's been a lot of attention this summer so far of like, where are we now? It's been 10 years since the Toledo water crisis. Has it gotten any better? Has it gotten worse? Where are we now? And so I get those kind of questions all the time, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can today. But this was a situation in which the toxins from the harmful algae got into the water supply of the city of Toledo and the suburbs around it, and about 500,000 people were not able to drink their water for a couple of days. And that gathered national attention, and it's because of that harmful algal blooms have been a focus ever since. But a little bit of background, why do we get into this situation? Why is Lake Erie so susceptible to harmful algal blooms? And it's, in large part, it's just the geographic position that we are in. This is the watershed of the Great Lakes, so all of this land drains into the Great Lakes. If it's outside this area, it's draining into the Mississippi River or somewhere else. If you look around like Lake Superior, it's mostly forested, sort of more pristine area, lower populations, and so Lake Superior doesn't get all this runoff from the watershed. Whereas Lake Erie has a lot of population around it. Those red areas are high population, and it has a large farming area. The orange is agriculture. So it's that high population, high agricultural usage of land leads to runoff of nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, that get into Lake Erie and grow those blooms. In addition to the population and the agriculture, especially the Maumee River watershed is huge. It's the single largest watershed in all of the Great Lakes, and about 75% of it or so is agriculture. So we have this large watershed, large agricultural watershed draining into western Lake Erie. In addition, it's draining into a shallow lake. If you look at a cross-section of the lakes, Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes. So you've got all this nutrient agricultural runoff draining into a shallow lake, and because it's shallow, it warms up quickly. The sun warms up Lake Erie more quickly than the other Great Lakes, and the algae really like warm water. So you got warm water, lots of nutrients, and it's the southernmost of the Great Lakes. So, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. That leads to some advantages for Lake Erie. For example, Lake Superior has half of the water in all of the Great Lakes. Lake Superior is very big, very deep, has half of the water, but only 2% of the fish. So you're not going to catch a lot of fish in Lake Erie. On the other hand, Lake Erie only has 2% of the water in the Great Lakes, but 50% of the fish. So that's why we have such a great fishery. And it's not just, Lake Erie itself is not just all the same. If you look at Lake Erie, there's 3 basins. The western part where we are here is the shallowest part, then the central basin, then the eastern basin. So this western basin is the shallowest and most productive part. So not only does Lake Erie have more fish than all the other Great Lakes combined, the western part of Lake Erie has more fish than the other parts of Lake Erie combined, and that makes us the walleye capital of the world. We would like to preserve our status of being the walleye capital of the world. And so those nutrients, that agricultural runoff and nutrients coming into Lake Erie grow these walleye. But too much can be too much. And when you get too many nutrients, fertilizers running into Lake Erie, then you start to get harmful algal blooms. And that's what we have here. These are all photos of microcystis. Microcystis is the main species of blue-green algae that we have in western Lake Erie. So just a little bit more background. What is a harmful algal bloom? How is it? Not all algae are the same. So we have 3 major algal groups in Lake Erie. The first are the diatoms. These tend to bloom in the spring and the fall. They give the water a golden color because they have this sort of gold pigments in them, and they have big oil droplets. This is a microscope photo. These are oil droplets, which make them very nutritious for the small crustaceans. They're called zooplankton, little shrimp that eat these diatoms. Those feed small fish, baby fish, which then goes up the food chain. So diatoms are the base of the food chain and produce the fish that we want. And you might smell a fish and say, oh, this fish has a fishy smell. But in fact, if you had a bucket full of diatoms, you would smell that same fishy smell. So it's not fish. Diatoms don't smell like fish. In fact, fish smell like diatoms. So that's where that smell comes from. So these diatoms are kind of like a nice, delicious French fry for the organisms. The green algae are another beneficial group. They're more like a nice green salad for the zooplankton. So these are both beneficial groups. It's that third group, which is the cyanobacteria or blue-green algae. I'll use those 2 terms interchangeably. Blue-green algae, cyanobacteria are the same thing. So the blue-green algae here are the ones that cause us problems. And there are several species. Dolichospermum and Aphanizomenum tend to bloom in the fall. So if you see a bloom out in Lake Erie in September or October, it's probably these guys. If you travel over Sandusky Bay or you see some inland lakes with blooms, it's probably this one, Planktothrix. They like inland waters. If you've ever been down to the shoreline, you see little kind of marbles, balled up marbles of dark green algae. That's probably Lyngbia. But the one that's out in the lake and the one that causes the most problems is Microcystis. And they grow in these clumpy colonies like this. Again, that's what Microcystis blooms look like in Lake Erie. And how did we get to this point? Well, during the last century, population increased, industry increased, agriculture increased, and between 1920 and 1964, the biomass of algae in Lake Erie increased almost six-fold, and those good algae, the diatoms, were replaced by the cyanobacteria. And that led to an agreement that those problems in Lake Erie, many of you in this room, like me, are old enough to remember the bad old days of the 1960s when Lake Erie was eventually declared a dead lake. And that was in part because of the Cuyahoga River catching on fire in Cleveland, and because of these algal blooms in the 1960s, dead fish washing up on the shore, Lake Erie was declared a dead lake. It was never a dead lake, but that was the national image of Lake Erie around this time in the late 1960s. But eventually, we got together with Canada, and we had the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was devoted to reducing the nutrients, especially phosphorus, that got into Lake Erie, to reduce these harmful algal blooms. And the mandate was on phosphorus control. So why do we focus on phosphorus? It's because high phosphorus concentrations, that's the main fertilizer that grows algae. It's what we call the limiting nutrient. If you remove everything else but you don't remove phosphorus, you're not going to make a dent. So phosphorus is the main focus. It leads to high algal biomass, and it leads to dominance by the cyanobacteria. If you are up in this area, this is phosphorus concentration on the x-axis. If you're high phosphorus concentrations like we have like in the Maumee River, your algal community is going to be dominated by cyanobacteria. If you're down in this area, which is the upper Great Lakes, you will have a nice diverse community of cyanobacteria that helps feed the food chain. So because of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement and other means of reducing phosphorus getting into Lake Erie, the condition of algae improved. Between 1970 and 1990, things were getting better and better and better in Lake Erie. But then sometime around the late 1990s, things took a turn for the worse, and algae started increasing again in Lake Erie. Late 90s, mid-90s, late 90s. And the reason for that, there's a couple reasons. One is, again, the major input is the Maumee River for nutrients. Discharge, water coming down the Maumee River increased. There was more flow of water starting in the mid-90s coming down the Maumee River. And then more importantly, there started to be more phosphorus in that water. The concentration was increasing. So if you multiply increasing discharge by increasing concentration, you get a big increasing load. And so you see this pattern from the mid-90s to basically the 2010 or so, the phosphorus was shooting up. And that corresponded with the return of those harmful algal blooms to Lake Erie. And you'll see this pattern again in a later slide. What do these blooms look like? Here's some satellite photos. The last year that we had a really pretty clear Lake Erie was 2002, and then these go through all the way to 2017. And you'll see there's some years with big blooms, some years with small blooms. The worst 2 years were 2011, in which the bloom reached all the way over to Cleveland and beyond Cleveland, so 2011, and then the biggest bloom of all was 2015. That was just a huge bloom. So those 2 years were the biggest blooms that we've ever had. And here's just another photo of the 2011 bloom, showing it filling most of the western basin of Lake Erie, off to the islands, beyond Pelee, of course, Marblehead. The whole western basin was full that year. So we've gotten pretty good at predicting how big these blooms are going to get. And it's due to the springtime input of phosphorus from the Maumee River is very correlated to the annual harmful algal bloom. So 2015, so this is cumulative phosphorus discharge. And so you see it starting at the beginning of March through August, you see the line going up and up and up. Each of these little bumps is a big rain event. So when it's dry, the line stays flat. When there's a big rain event, the line bumps up again. So it kind of stair steps up with each big rain event that we have. Again, that maximum inflow, that was 2015, leading to the largest bloom we ever had. The minimum down here, I think that was 2002, so the smallest bloom we ever have. And then there's 2023 is in there, 2017. And where are we this year? The red line is this year. So we had a lot of rain in April. That line really increased during the month of April. But since April, it's been relatively dry. discharge coming down the Maumee River. So that line has stayed pretty flat. And then the prediction then is that we're going to have basically a medium or a moderate year. So not the biggest bloom we've ever had, not the smallest, but just sort of a moderate bloom. And so these predictions lead to this figure, which shows the bloom severity of the last several years, since 2002. Some years have a large bloom, some are small, and they kind of go up and down, and that depends on whether it's basically a dry year or a wet year. It's really driven by rainfall and by precipitation and runoff from the watershed. And then, so this year, the prediction is right there. So that's for a moderate year. There's a little red bar on top, and that's kind of a little fudge factor, because who knows what's going to happen between now and August. We could have some huge drenching rain event that just rains buckets for three days, and that's what that little bar accounts for right there. But in general, that's the prediction for 2024. It's going to be pretty much like last year. It's going to be similar to the last 3 years. So, and if you look at the figure, it looks like it looks maybe a little bit promising. The biggest blooms we had were in 2011, 2015. We haven't had another record-breaking bloom since then. So it's been 9 years since the peak. So maybe things are coming down a little bit. But that's mostly because we've had drier weather over the last 9 years. Whether we can take credit for drier weather, I'm not sure that we can. Okay, so that's kind of the forecast. That's where we are now. So I'm going to shift now to the second part, which is efforts to prevent and mitigate harmful algal blooms. And the one way that we do this is what I call a land-to-liver approach. We have to deal with algal blooms in our lives, and there's many ways we can focus on this. First is we can focus on preventing blooms in the first place. What we are doing on the land drives these blooms. So let's do things on land to prevent the runoff, to prevent the harmful algal blooms. But the blooms are with us. We have to deal with them now. So how can we better detect and predict the harmful algal blooms in the lake? And then how can we better detect and treat our drinking water, and then understand how the toxin in the blooms affects the human body? So there's research in all of these different areas. So starting with preventing harmful algal blooms. The biggest effort that's going on right now is the H2 Ohio program, and that is Governor DeWine has invested just for this past year $270 million of your tax dollars going towards trying to prevent harmful algal blooms in several ways. One is $61 million a year on farming practices, incentivizing farmers to use best management practices to help keep fertilizer on the farm, use less fertilizer, all those things. $46.5 million a year restoring wetlands. I mentioned before we're involved in restoring wetlands. These are restoring wetlands all over the state. One phrase you might hear is wetlands are the kidney of the landscape. They collect water running off from farms, they process the nutrients, they store the nutrients, they store water, and then cleaner water runs out the other end of the wetlands. So wetlands are great filters, and we need to restore a lot of wetlands. So there's money for that. There's also money going for other things, such as providing safe drinking water, things like restoring old septic systems, lead drinking water lines in homes, and things like that. But these are the two main ones, these two features. This Department of Agriculture, $61 million a year. Those efforts go into these first 9 categories. So there's always questions about what are the farmers doing? What could farmers be doing? And that's what this list is about. If you want to just take a minute to look at soil testing. Soil testing for nutrient concentrations in farm fields. And that will tell a farmer whether they need more fertilizer or not. Because the temptation is always just to add more. I'll be on the safe side, I'll add more fertilizer. Well, that's not good for Lake Erie. So if you know exactly how much fertilizer nutrients are in your soil, then you know whether you need to add it or not. Variable rate fertilization, that's being able to drive back and forth across a farm field and have your equipment add fertilizer or not just based on whether it needs it or not. So instead of just adding the same amount to a whole field, the applicator drives back and forth to the field, and the fertilizer is being turned on and off. So it's just being applied just to the spots where it's needed. Injecting fertilizer below the surface, one big problem we have is that when fertilizer is just spread on top of a field, the next big rainstorm that comes along washes it off into the nearest ditch. Eventually, it makes it into Lake Erie. But if we can put the fertilizer down a couple inches into the soil, that helps it stay there. So this injection of fertilizer into the soil. Manure incorporation. You'll hear a lot now about factory farms, the CAFOs, and they're just generating, millions of gallons of liquid manure that who knows what happens to it. There's efforts towards improving how we deal with all this manure that's coming out of these large animal operations. Conservation crop rotation, rotating crops so the soil holds nutrients better. Cover crops in the wintertime that, again, hold nutrients in the soil by planting a cover crop. Drainage water management, being able to, all the farms around here have tiles underneath them. They have drains that drain the fields so that they don't stay swampy. But sometimes those tiles can be turned off and turned back on at the right time. So being able to do drain water management, two-stage ditch construction so ditches can flood and hold water longer. Edge of field buffers, buffer strips of plants to capture fertilizer running off, and then finally that big wetland effort that I talked about. So these are the main things that H2 Ohio is doing to help farmers retain nutrients on the land. Okay, so that's what we're doing on land. Let's go to what's happening in the lake, detection and prediction of harmful algal blooms. This is mostly being done by NOAA. There's a NOAA laboratory in Ann Arbor, Michigan called the Great Lakes Environmental Research Lab, and they do a lot of research. And if I can get this to play, it'll show you the present bloom prediction forecast. So here's a little animation. Hopefully that'll start up. There it goes. So that's predicting, starting on the 7th, where the bloom is going to be going. So now it's on the 9th, so it's today, and then it'll move, I think, into tomorrow. So it's using the weather forecast, wind and currents, to predict where the bloom is going to move. So if you're a boater on Lake Erie, you could look at this forecast and say, like, oh, okay, the bloom's going to go here or there over the next couple of days. So, and that just cycles through. So that's one of the tools that we have to know where blooms are and where they're going to go based on the weather forecast. Here's the latest satellite photo of western Lake Erie. This is from just 2 days ago. There's a pretty big bloom now off of Monroe, Michigan, and it's starting to kind of move out this way. So, in a week or so, the bloom might hit the islands. It's already pretty big in Maumee Bay, and this is unusual. This is an early year. I've been watching the temperatures. Lake Erie warmed up about 2 weeks faster than it normally does. I don't know if the mayflies were a little early this year. The mayflies were early in Toledo by a couple weeks. So everything is about 2 weeks early this year. The bloom is now here 2 weeks earlier than it would be. It's not at Lakeside yet, but might be here earlier than you would expect. This condition, what we see here, that wouldn't normally happen until late July, maybe beginning of August. So we are a couple weeks ahead. And oh, by the way, I just learned how to put in QR codes. So if anybody wants to take out their phone and take a picture, you can just zap that right onto your website. So I'm very proud of myself. Just learned how to do QR codes. Another way that we know about what's going on in Lake Erie is we have buoys out there. All of these dots on the map are buoys. Most of the buoys have this instrument called a YSI EXO sonde. Each of those little cylinders on the bottom measures something. It measures all things like temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, which is saltiness of the water, total algae, the cyanobacteria, and they also measure air parameters as well. And I like to point out that YSI stands for Yellow Springs Instruments. These are made in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and they're used all over the country and all over the world. They are the premier instrument, so I'm proud that we're using Ohio stuff here. And so most of these buoys have these instruments on them. But you have to point out there's no toxin sensors. We can't measure the toxin in the water with these kind of sensors. So here's an example that I pulled up. This is from the buoy that we have in Maumee Bay. And this is from middle of May to just a few, I don't know why I said July 24th. It's actually July, like 2 days ago. Anyway, so the purple line is total algae. And so we had a bloom of diatoms. This is the good algae that was blooming back at the beginning of June. The blue line is the blue-green algae, and it was flat. So there's no blue-green algae, but then here we are, beginning of July. You see the blue line starting to spike up. So that's showing you that the bloom is starting in Maumee Bay, late June, beginning of July. And these buoys are online. You can go to them, and you can just see what's going on at any given moment. They probably upload about every 5 minutes or so. That's our buoy that we maintain by the University of Toledo, and these are some of my students. We go out and we put the buoy in May. We take it out again in October. As I said, the buoys are not able to measure toxin, but there are advances in being able to actually measure the toxin. Toxin measurement is a laboratory-intensive process. You have to take a sample, bring it back to the laboratory. You have to process the algae, and you do what's called an ELISA. It's a bunch of reactions have to be done. It's kind of a complex thing, but now we've developed robots that can do it for us. And this 2G ESP, ESP stands for Environmental Science Processor. This about the size of a 50-gallon drum. It sits on the bottom of the lake. Every 2 hours, it sucks in a water sample and processes it, tells you what the toxin is, and then radios that by cell signal back to shore. So this is great. It's a big advancement, but it sits on the bottom in one place. The third generation is they've taken all of this instrumentation, they've miniaturized it now, fit it into this torpedo, and this is a torpedo-shaped device, can now swim through the water and suck up water every 2 hours or so, take a measurement, so it's not just stuck in one place. So that's another advancement. However, this torpedo device cannot operate in shallow water. When they tried to operate it in shallow water, it just took a nosedive and stuck in the mud. So it can only be out in maybe 20 or 30 feet of water. So for shallow areas, they've developed this new sort of automated robotic boat. It's solar powered, and it can go through the water, and it's got the laboratory robot inside, sucks up a water sample and tells you what toxin it is. So this is the newest iteration, and they call it the Shark. I can't remember what that stands for, but this is the kind of thing that NOAA in Ann Arbor is working a lot on, remote access, remote measurement of toxin. So then the next part then is drinking water treatment. So we've covered what's going on, how we know what's going on in the lake. Let's talk about how we are treating our water. And this is where places like City of Toledo have made a lot of advancements, and and other water treatment plants as well. The main things, nothing new here, they treat water with potassium permanganate, and that breaks down toxin, also prevents zebra mussels from clogging the pipes. The newest thing Toledo has added is ozone. Ozone is an oxidant that will blast apart any toxins that are in the water, as well as chlorine. Chlorine's another oxidant, disinfects the water, destroys any toxin in the water. And one of the main things that they use too is powdered activated carbon. This is like your Brita filter. It will absorb toxins in the water. So they spend millions of dollars a year on powdered activated carbon. Reverse osmosis is used in some inland water plants. Reverse osmosis, very good at removing toxin, but also very expensive. And biological filtration. When the water goes through the water plant, it's going through these sand beds that have active biological organisms in them that eat up all the organics. And we are developing ways of taking advantage of biology. There are bacteria out there that love to eat toxin. So we've learned now to identify what those bacteria are. We can grow those bacteria in the laboratory. They're harmless to us, but they eat toxin. So if we can grow a big vat of toxin-eating bacteria, if we get a bloom in Lake Erie, we pour in the toxin-eating bacteria, and it chews it all up. And that's really nice because then there's no sort of byproducts, chemical byproducts. It's all very natural. So a lot of research in the biological filtration. So also, we're advancing how to detect algae in the water plant. And this is something I'll spend a little time on because this project I'm involved in. We're developing new instruments that can better identify the different kinds of algae and then to determine the cell condition of the cyanobacteria. How healthy is the algae, the cyanobacteria? This is important for drinking water treatment and also important for aerosolized toxins. And I'll talk about those in just a minute. And we have one of these instruments now. This is me and my postdoc, and we're at the Toledo water plant, and we've installed this instrument that is constantly monitoring the water. So this is every 15 minutes, it's measuring the algae in the water and reporting that online. So the water plant managers love having this. They go online just to see what's coming into their plant at any given time. So I'm going to talk about, for a second, the importance of bloom condition. So we all know about the 2014 water crisis. There was 4 big factors that caused the Toledo water crisis in 2014. The bloom was located near the water intake. So it was very concentrated bloom around the Toledo water intake. It was very high biomass of algae. It was a very toxic year. Some years the bloom is more toxic than others. We don't understand that yet. Why is it more toxic one year than another? This year was a very toxic year. And there was a period where it was very windy, and that forced the bloom down into the water near the bottom where the intake is. So those 4 factors helped cause that bloom. But the city knew about it. They knew that they had a toxic bloom. They knew all these factors, and they were treating the water like they always did, and it should have worked. So why didn't the treatment processes work in 2014 like they always had before? And it's because we're pretty sure now there was a 5th factor that was not known at the time. And the 5th factor was that there was a virus attack on the bloom in Lake Erie. These are viruses that attack the blue-green algae. They're called cyanophages, and they break the cells open. And when the cells break open, these are viruses attacking a blue-green algae cell. When the cells break open, they release the toxin into the water. And then it's in a dissolved form, and it's much, much more difficult to remove. The normal processes don't work anymore. And before they knew it, the toxin was flowing through the plant. So just to describe that a little bit more, normally, almost all the time, the toxin is inside the cell. So this circle represents a microcystis, a blue-green algae cell, with all the toxin inside. And I kind of think of those as, think of a water balloon, a toxin-filled water balloon. If you had to remove those from if you had a swimming pool full of toxin-filled water balloons, you'd want to very carefully remove them without breaking them open. That's what water plants do. They use coagulation, flocculation, and filtration to carefully remove the cells without breaking them open. There's still a little bit of toxin that's dissolved, but all of these processes, chlorine, ozone, and things, can take care of this residual toxin that's in the water. But if you think you have this situation, but unbeknownst to you, you get this situation where you have a cyanophage outbreak, the cells are breaking open, you have a ton of extracellular toxin. You think you have just a little bit, but you have a ton of extracellular toxin that you didn't know about, and before you even know it, it's getting through your plant and into your drinking water system. This is probably what happened in 2014. We don't know for sure because we can't go back in time. But it happened again in 2019. Had another cyanophage outbreak in 2019, and this time the water plant was measuring it. And so this is data from the Toledo water plant. This is the green line is total toxin, and the blue line is dissolved toxin. And so there's virtually no dissolved toxin until that bloom hit. And then boom, overnight, the dissolved toxin in the water went up by a factor of 10. Luckily, it was a low toxin year, so the plant was able to handle it. But if this had been like 2014, it could have been a big problem. So what we've done now is do some research that shows that we can detect when those cells are breaking open. That's these new instruments can detect in real time when those cells are breaking open. Here's an experiment where we have a culture of microcystis that's very healthy and growing. The red line is the breaking open signal. There's nothing going on. But when we put some cyanophages into the experiment, the culture started to die, and we got this signal, this red signal showing like those cells are breaking open. And that's a signal you can get, like, that's an instantaneous signal. And the key here is speed. You know, if you can do these analyses and get an answer a day or two later, that's too slow. You need an instant answer, and that's what these new devices can tell you instantly, that those cells are starting to break open. You need to add more activated carbon. You need to do something quickly. So that's sort of an advancement in water treatment. And then moving on to human health, that's the last part of that land to liver. I call it land to liver because the cyanotoxin attacks the liver. And I think I'm meandering a little bit too. I'm going to have to speed up a little bit because we're already 45 minutes in. There are new sensitive diagnostic methods for detecting whether humans have been exposed. I mean, during the Toledo water crisis, people were coming into hospitals saying, I think I'm sick. I think I've been exposed to toxic algae. There was no way of knowing. There's no test that a doctor could do to see if you've been exposed. Those tests are now being developed. There are certain enzymes that are produced, biomarkers that are produced when a human has been exposed to toxin, the algal toxin. Those are now being identified. There's studies, you know, we know, like, well, there's toxin limits, World Health Organization, and so on, but those apply to healthy people. What if you have pre-existing liver disease? What if you have things like inflammatory bowel disease that allow your things to get through your bowels? You might be more susceptible to algal toxin than the regular population. So there's a lot of studies going on in that area as well. And as a preventative, identified, like you know, we've identified the bacteria that can break down toxin. We are identifying the enzymes that those bacteria produce so that we can isolate those enzymes, put them in a probiotic, and if somebody's been exposed to toxin, they could potentially take a pill or take this probiotic drink, and it'll help destroy all those toxins that they might have been exposed to. So these are kind of the next things that are coming along, protecting human health. Okay, so talked about all those areas, land, lake, water treatment, human health. I just want to take a minute to talk about the Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative. This is another thing that we should be very proud of in Ohio. The governor has put in several $million. This is $19 million over the last 10 years that the governor has put towards Ohio universities to allow university researchers to investigate harmful algal blooms. So, you know, maybe somebody's a chemist and they have some expertise. Maybe somebody's, you know, a microbiologist. They have expertise. So it's gathering people, applying their expertise to harmful algal blooms. And those areas that they are studying are all those same areas: tracking blooms, producing safe drinking water, protecting human health, and engaging farmers. And I'm just going to mention a couple projects that have been funded over the last few years. For example, in tracking blooms, we discover how blooms can contaminate groundwater. If you live on Put-in Bay or Kelly's Island, you live near the shoreline, and you have a well, there's a pretty good chance that the cracks in the limestone under the ground, pretty good chance you might have lake water coming into your well, in which case you might get toxins coming into your well. So understanding how water moves through the bedrock, through cracks and so on, and getting into people's well along the shoreline, that's important. Improving how satellites are used. As I mentioned, we use a lot of powdered activated carbon in water treatment plants. That stuff is expensive. It's produced by Calgon and others. It's very expensive stuff. Cities spend tens of millions of dollars a year with powdered activated carbon. Can we generate that cheaper? What do we have a lot of in Ohio? We have a lot of corn cobs. Can we make powdered activated carbon from corn cobs? Yes. So that may be a way. You know, it's an economic advantage. Can we bring the cost of water treatment down by using this resource that we have? So using corn cobs, discovering new cyanotoxins that we haven't even identified yet. Potential treatment for algal exposure, that's the one I just mentioned, with a probiotic. Assessing aerosolized cyanotoxin. When those cells break open, when we have a virus attack in the lake and the cells break open, wave action on the water can cause the toxin to become airborne. And so somebody who's, you know, windsurfing or paddling along the shoreline during one of these outbreaks could be exposed to toxin through breathing it in. A lot of new research going on in that area. And then engaging farmers. Can we slow down water? Are there ways that we can slow down water, keep it on the fields longer? Manure application. Can we optimize the way we use manure so that it grows crops really well but stays on the land? So these are all just examples of the Ohio's Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative. Okay, so this question people always ask, well, we're doing all this stuff on the land. We're H2 Ohio, you're doing all this stuff. Is it working? So I expect that hands raising. Is it working? So I'm going to answer that in advance. Not really. The answer is not really working. The proof to the pudding is here. Flow-weighted mean concentration of phosphorus. This kind of takes weather out of the equation. And this is from the mid-1970s up to about the early 2020s. And phosphorus concentration was really high, but then it came down. Again, in the mid-1990s, phosphorus concentration followed that black trend line. Phosphorus concentration went shooting up. That's when we started getting the blooms again. So look at where we are now. I would say we've made enough effort so far that the problem is no longer getting worse. This trend in the mid-1990s, it hasn't continued. We haven't been shooting up, continuing to shoot up. If we did, Lake Erie would be in tremendous trouble. So we've evened things out. We've leveled off, but we've leveled off at a level that is way higher than it needs to be. If we stay at this level, we'll never get rid of harmful algal blooms. So it's kind of a good news, bad news situation. Things are no longer getting worse, but they're a long way from getting better. So that's sort of the bottom line of this. So the question is, what else can we do? And this gets to the last part of my talk, which is this bold new idea for fixing Lake Erie. And just real quick refresher, what grows a harmful algal bloom? Well, you need sunlight, you need warm water, you need nutrients, and it takes time. The cells don't just develop overnight. It takes weeks for the bloom to develop. So you need all of these things. We can't affect sunlight. We can't really affect warm water. We can work on reducing nutrients, but we can also do something about this time factor, and that's what I'm going to talk about. Going back to the nutrient concentrations, high phosphorus concentrations in the Maumee River. Here's a big plume of muddy water coming out of the Maumee River. This grows blooms. So the Maumee River, the concentrations are way up here where you grow cyanobacteria. In contrast, low concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen don't grow cyanobacteria. So if you look at what's coming down the Detroit River, the concentrations are way down here. That is relatively clean water coming down the Detroit River. And if we had this water, if we had Detroit River water throughout Lake Erie, we would not have any harmful algal blooms at all. But we don't. So the idea is, can we do something about it? So looking at water residence time, these arrows represent currents. We have a huge flow coming in from the Detroit River. 90% of the water coming into Lake Erie comes down the Detroit River. It's this massive flow coming down to the Detroit River, but it tends to bypass Toledo, Maumee Bay area, and it goes shooting out over to around Pelee Island and into the Central Basin. And the result is the residence time of the water. Western Lake Erie, the residence time is about 30 days on average. But in this area around Maumee Bay, it can be 70, 80 days or more. Just water just sitting there around Maumee Bay. So that warm water, full of nutrients, just sitting there for 50, 60 days, that's a recipe for a huge algal bloom. So the idea is, can we get this water moving? Can we flush it out of there? So here's the current Detroit River flow pattern. Comes down, kind of turns around, then goes over out into the Central Basin. Maumee River water just sits there. So the idea is, can we do something to redirect that flow a little bit? Can we build some sort of structure, a string of islands or a wall or something up here that would divert some of this flow down into Maumee Bay, flush the water out and mix it? Ideally, we're trying to mix the water. So we're introducing this structure to achieve lower nutrient concentrations. Because if you look out in the central Lake Erie, we don't have harmful algal blooms out in central Lake Erie. It's the same water that's back here, that's out here. It's just that it's been mixed by then. So if we are able to mix the Maumee River water with the Detroit River water, if we can have that mixing occur back here, Western Lake Erie would look more like the Central Basin does now, and we would be able to prevent blooms. So I proposed this idea to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they liked it. So the Army Corps of Engineers has spent the last year investigating this idea. They've been using computer models. I don't do computer modeling, but they can. And they did a study simulating what would happen. So they created this high-resolution grid for their models, and I think these models probably take a day or two to run. And then they put in, on their computer models, they put in several different wall sort of ideas. So, and I won't go into all those details, but the bottom line is it didn't really work, unfortunately, because whether this is a short wall or a long wall, the water from the Detroit River always wants to turn to the east and head east. So even if this wall is longer, the water just heads east, and it's not mixing very well with the Maumee River. So unfortunately, that idea may not pan out. I'm not totally convinced yet. But what we did next was start to look at, well, what if instead of trying to bring the Detroit River down into Maumee Bay, what if we tried to push Maumee River water out where it would meet the Detroit River current? So the next idea was to maybe put a structure along the Maumee River to force the Maumee River further out into Western Basin where it would reach the Detroit River plume and get mixed in. And that seems to have a little bit more promise. And this is where computer modeling comes in. This is a conservative tracer study where on the computer they filled Lake Erie with Maumee River water. So that's all red Maumee River water. And let the computer simulation run for 30 days. After 30 days, the Detroit River has flushed out most of that red water, and this blue water here is that pretty pure Detroit River water coming down. And zooming in, the effect of that wall was that this is without the wall, what it would look like, and then if you put the wall in there, it really had a big effect on this area to the southeast of Maumee Bay, but it kind of made conditions worse on the northwest side. So to show that a little bit more clearly, blue represents better conditions, red represents worse conditions. So on one side of the wall, conditions got better. On the other side of the wall, conditions got worse. But this is where the bloom tends to develop each year. If we can prevent a bloom here, we can potentially prevent it from spreading to the rest of Western Lake Erie. So this holds a lot of promise. However, we don't want to upset the people in Point Place, Michigan by making the blooms worse there. So the next step then, next steps are to maybe make a shorter wall, try different scenarios to reduce the negative effects, rerun those models, and then there's a biological model you can run to see if it would actually reduce blooms. And then if you're proposing something this dramatic, something that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars, you want a second, third, and fourth opinion. So we would like to try to get NOAA, Limnotech, and some others who have the capability of doing this kind of modeling to also do it, see if we come up with the same answers. I mean, this is early stages, but it's something that we need to be thinking about because, honestly, I've been going to harmful algal bloom meetings. We've been having the same meeting for 10 years. You know, what are we going to do? What are we, you know, and there's not a whole lot of advancements. We advance technology, but this is something that may actually be able to have an effect, and it's something we should have in our back pocket. We're 10 years after the Toledo water crisis. If in another 10 years we haven't been able to reduce harmful algal blooms, we need to start looking at ideas like this. Just to wrap things up, what's the forecast? It's an average bloom, but early this year. Land deliver approach, we're protecting the public in multiple ways. H2 Ohio is doing a lot, spending a lot of money, but is it enough? There's an economic study out of University of Michigan saying Ohio needs to spend 4 times as much as it is now to have a real effect. The Harmful Algal Bloom Research Initiative, one effect of the bloom in Lake Erie is that Ohio universities are becoming real experts in this area, and we get consulted by people all over the country. When they start having blooms in Oregon or Florida and wherever, they come to us and say, what are you guys doing in Ohio? You know, can you help us? And then that new approach, just giving nature a nudge, move that water around a little bit differently to try to mix it and prevent harmful algal blooms. So that's almost an hour, but if you can stick around and have questions, I'm happy to. I think that's it for me, so thank you. Drink of water.
Thank you, Tom. We've had a number of presentations over many years from many people, including you, and that's been very helpful to many of us. But a couple of things that I'm remembering is a number of years ago, the Detroit River was a source of nutrients, and it sounds like that may not be so much any longer. And number two, some of the researchers I've heard speak talk about the concern that Ohio farmers or Indiana farmers have in following the next big change, which has been recommended by the scientists, and saying, there they go again. Can you comment on either of those?
I can comment most effectively on your first question, which is about Detroit River. The city of Detroit had the largest wastewater treatment plant in the country. And at one time, they were not doing a very good job. But in the 1970s, that Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement Act, that forced Detroit to really improve their water treatment plant. So their treatment plant is no longer, the sewage from the city of Detroit is no longer a major factor. As I said, that water coming down from Detroit now is really pretty darn clean. So for the last 20, 30 years, that has not been a factor. I know when we had the 2014 water crisis, some people were blaming Detroit. That was not, they shouldn't have. That was not Detroit's fault. We like to blame Michigan for all kinds of stuff, but we can't use it blame. Your second question about what, and I understand, like we told farmers, 30 years ago, we told farmers switch from plowing to no-till, and now we're telling them to do something different. And, and that's a huge investment. It's an investment in millions of dollars worth of farming equipment, and, farmers want to know that we're really sure. They want help to pay for that kind of stuff. But I'm not a farming expert. I don't know what to tell farmers other than this is our best science at the time. We can't give you a golden clad guarantee that it's going to fix it, but it's the best we know how to do. So yeah, I'm not a good answer about farming. Yeah?
Okay, so yeah, I guess mine is a follow-up to that because we talked, in your presentation, you talk about educating the farmers and you talk about, tracking what the farmers are putting into the Maumee River. But there was no talk about regulatory actions taken to prevent that. I mean, millions and millions and millions of dollars every year to try to fix a problem that we know the cause of. Mm-hmm. It seems like incentivizing the farmers or regulating what they can do seems to be, maybe needs to be introduced by Governor DeWine and do some of, like preventing the problem from happening in the first place instead of trying to fix it literally downstream.
Yeah, thank you for raising that point. One thing I should say is all of this H2 Ohio stuff, it's all voluntary. When the phrase is, it's all carrot and no stick. There's nothing telling a farmer, that they can't do this or they can't do that. We're trying to incentivize them as much as we can, but there's not much appetite in the state of Ohio for forcing farmers to do anything. So that's because we live in Ohio. I don't know, if this is important to you, then it's a voting issue, and you vote for people who will make this a priority. So I don't know what else to tell you. We live in Ohio. Yes?
Not to take away from that, which sounds like a powerful solution, but when you talk about moving water different ways and creating walls to shift it, does it all have to happen from nature? Can you use pumps?
The amount of water that we're talking about is so massive, you'd probably have to build like 5 power plants just to move water like that. This is billions of gallons of water that we're talking about. So I can't think of any, you could build pumps, but the amount of power that it would take to run these massive pumps would just be incredible. I mean, the city of Toledo's water pumping, that's a drop in the bucket, but that's the biggest the biggest power draw that the city of Toledo has is its pumping station. So to move water mechanically by pumping is very, very expensive. Again, I don't know the size of those pumps in New Orleans, like draining keeping the seawater out, keeping the Mississippi River out. I don't know what that volume is compared to the volume that you would need to flush Western Lake Erie. I still think, I mean, I'm talking about the kind of volume that flows over Niagara Falls. You know, like, can you let's say it's even a third of the volume that flows over Niagara Falls in a given day. Could you actually pump that much? That would just be so massive. It's hard for me to contemplate it. We don't need pumps because the Detroit River is such a massive flow. It powers itself. You know, just nudge it a little bit different direction. Well, it might. You know, I'm trying to get a second opinion on that because I'm not convinced that the Corps of Engineers models are completely accurate, so I want to get a second opinion. So maybe I'll come back in 3 years and have a different answer.
My question is, we seem to blame the Maumee River for all these problems.
Yeah.
But have studies been done that reflect what the Sandusky River, what the Black River, the Rocky River, all these other tributaries that drain into the Lake Erie, have there studies been done about what effect they have in terms of the amount put in?
So we know the nutrients coming in from many of those rivers, Sandusky River, Portage River, and stuff, because one thing that Ohio has is we have the best tributary monitoring program in the country out of Heidelberg University in Tiffin. They've been monitoring Ohio tributaries in some cases for the last 50 years. And it's amazing, it's a national treasure, the level of water tributary monitoring that we have. So we have data on that. Sandusky River is like the Maumee River, only much smaller, and it's also mostly contained by Sandusky Bay. So the stuff that flows into Sandusky Bay grows a bloom in Sandusky Bay, but it usually stays there. It doesn't get pumped out into Lake Erie. So the Portage River, again, just like the Maumee River, I don't mean to blame farmers in the Maumee watershed because Sandusky and Portage are just like the Maumee River. They're just smaller, so the proportional effect is smaller. Further east towards Cleveland, Black River, and others, those are less agricultural, and there's less runoff from those rivers just because they don't have the same kind of corn and soybeans and animal operations that we have here in Northwest Ohio. Back to the economic question, you know, if you ask an economist, the economist would say it's simple. You tax the things you don't want and you incentivize the things you do want. So, you know, maybe we tax fertilizer, you know, so it becomes more valuable and farmers don't use it quite as freely, and then use those tax revenues to incentivize the things we do want. That's what an economist would tell you. Yeah.
I know that for smaller scale algae blooms, like skimming the algae off the surface of the water can be like relatively successful in reducing toxins that leach into the water. For, I think it was the second model of the wall that you were planning on building that sort of centralized a lot of the Maumee River water on the western side of the lake and condenses it there. Do you think that if that plan goes ahead in condensing all of the potentially disruptive algae blooms into that smaller area, do you think that skimming the water for the algae and like artificially removing it would be a feasible solution given the much more condensed and like smaller scale of the algae blooms?
That's a good question. And when we first generated that result, the Corps of Engineers thought, great, we can concentrate the bloom in this one area and then just take care of it right there by skimming or some other means. That's possible. although it looks small on the map, it's still a big area. You know, that's still miles across. And it might be possible to do some skimming. The problem with those kind of approaches is that if you have a layer of algae on the surface, the bloom becomes light limited. It's not growing anymore because now it's covered and there's no light reaching down. So it's growing as much as it can. As soon as you skim off that surface, now you've increased light again, it just grows right back again. So you have to skim day after day after day. You're almost helping the bloom at the same time you're reducing it. So that's one factor. The other thing is, you know, any kind of device that's out there and the waves come up on Maumee Bay, it's going to sink. So, you know, I've seen lots of little robotic things, and I think that's going to sink, you know, the first time the weather comes up. So those kind of ideas are better in smaller reservoirs, inland lakes, but I know where you're coming from, and the Corps of Engineers thought the same thing. Like, maybe we can concentrate the bloom in one area and then tackle it there. So that's maybe not impossible.
Are any other states that border on Lake Erie helping to reduce the problem?
Yes, although I'm not as familiar with their efforts. I know the state of Michigan has some programs to incentivize farmers the same way Ohio does, not to the same extent that Ohio does. Ohio is spending much more than the other states because it's mostly us, it's mostly our watershed. Michigan has much smaller sort of land that's causing it, but they are doing some. We could probably use some increased help from Indiana. Some of the worst areas are up by Fort Wayne, Indiana. We could probably use some more help from Indiana. So to answer your question, I don't think the other states they could be contributing more. They definitely could be.
Do you know what percentage of the nutrients, phosphorus coming into Lake Erie comes from CAFOs as opposed to farmers that are spreading granulated phosphorus?
I have heard estimates that it's not very much. It's like maybe 10% or something like that compared to row crops. I don't know where those numbers come from. I don't know how they estimate that or how accurate that is. But you know, the farming experts think that it's still row crops are a much bigger source than the CAFOs. That's what I've heard. I don't have any more information than kind of what the experts say. But yeah, I think, you know, when people blame CAFOs, I'm sympathetic. I think CAFOs are not good for many, many reasons, not just because of the runoff. But I don't think there's been enough research into CAFOs. I mean, I think that's one of the, we spend tons of dollars on investigating all sorts of things, but when it comes to investigating CAFOs, the dollars aren't there. Like, why aren't we, you know, who's going to support investigating CAFOs? If you don't want to find the answer, you're not going to investigate and invest in the research. And so, you know, we could use some more support for like, hey, we need some tax dollars investigating CAFOs and find out what they're really doing and you know, what's the rate of violation? What are they really doing, you know, in terms of contributing to the factor? So right now I feel like it's very fuzzy and very guesswork because there's not enough information out there about CAFOs because some people don't want to know the answers.
I would second that question because the crop farmers are planting filter strips and cover crops and doing the things that research has told us. But the biggest difference in the Maumee watershed has been the increase in the number of CAFOs. So we like our cheap meat, but how much do we like it and what are we willing to pay for it?
I completely agree. The agricultural system in our country is designed to keep food cheap and to funnel profits to the biggest producers and corporations. I don't think individual farmers are getting wealthy. So, and the way to produce cheap food is to outsource your problems to the environment. You know, Lake Erie is paying the price. I personally would be fine paying more for my food. In fact, we get food from, you know, CSAs and farmers and things. So you can do your part and try to find food that is responsibly grown. It's more expensive and harder to find, but yes, I totally agree with you. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm talking jargon here. CAFO stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, and it's these large barns. Probably some of you know the numbers off of your head, if it's like over 500 cows or 50,000 chickens or something like. I don't have those numbers in my head, but it's an animal it's a feeding operation where the animals are not out grazing. They're in a barn. You bring in food in, you feed them. It's very concentrated, and it's very efficient, but it generates a ton of manure. And usually what would you do with that manure? You'd go spread it on your farm field. But if you have so many animals and not enough land, what do you do with it? It's just disposed of irresponsibly on the ground, and it runs off. So managing all the manure that comes out of these animal operations is a big problem. It's also not good for the animals. Like, who wants to live, it's like, animals living in tiny little spaces. It's not, so.
If phosphorus is the problem, is there a substitute for phosphorus that could work as a fertilizer and not feed the algae bloom? And number two, would it be, that thing that you mentioned that eats the algae but is not harmful to humans? Could that be part of the fertilizer and wash out into the bay?
There's no substitute for phosphorus. You cannot grow a crop without adding phosphorus. And if you don't add phosphorus, eventually the soil becomes depleted and it won't grow a crop anymore. As far as something that would kind of eat the phosphorus, well, that's the algae. The algae are eating. They're kind of the bacteria and the microorganisms that love the phosphorus the most. So there's no silver bullet there. Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you.